3 summers ago, I took a week off work to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. I wasn't trying to set any records. I just wanted a few days away from my phone, my office, and the constant noise of everyday life. I was hiking alone, but I'd done plenty of solo backpacking before. I carried a paper map, enough food for 5 days, and a dented metal camping mug that had been with me on every trip since college. By late afternoon on my 3rd day, storm clouds were rolling over the ridgeline. I checked my map and found a small, designated campsite beside a creek, about a mile ahead. I reached it just before sunset. The campsite looked empty. No tents, no backpacks, no hammocks tied between the trees. Still, something felt used there. It was fresh firewood stacked beside the fire ring, not scattered, stacked neatly. A pair of logs had been arranged like benches. Someone had even swept leaves away from the center of the site. I figured another hiker had packed up early that morning. Then, I knelt beside the fire pit. The stones were warm. I looked around again. The woods were completely still. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing answered except the creek. The logical part of my brain told me someone had probably left an hour earlier. The uneasy part wondered why they'd leave behind such a perfectly organized campsite. Rain was coming. Didn't have many options, so I pitched my tent anyway. As darkness settled over the forest, the trail became strangely quiet. Voices, no trekking poles, no distant laughter from other campers, just insects and the steady sound of water moving over rocks. I heated dinner and drank coffee from my dented metal camping mug, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 10 o'clock, I climbed into my sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of slow footsteps, crunch, pause, crunch, not an animal. They were too deliberate. The footsteps circled my campsite once, then stopped. I held my breath. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't shine a flashlight. After nearly a minute, the footsteps faded back into the trees. I waited another hour before convincing myself it had probably been another hiker looking for camp in the dark. A morning made everything seem less frightening, until I stepped outside. My backpack had been moved only a few feet, but I knew exactly where I'd left it, leaning against a tree beside my tent. Now it sat beside the fire. Nothing had been stolen. My food was untouched. Even my dented metal camping mug was exactly where I'd left it. I packed quickly before leaving. I noticed something else. Behind the campsite, beyond a patch of thick rhododendron, was a narrow footpath that didn't appear on my map. It wasn't an official trail, just a faint path leading uphill. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it for maybe 50 yards. Then I stopped. Hidden beneath a cluster of evergreen branches was a small clearing. There wasn't a tent. Instead, someone had built a shelter from fallen logs, camouflage netting, and tarps so weathered they blended into the forest. Floored old food cans, a folding chair, wood stove made from a metal bucket. This wasn't a temporary campsite. Someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months. I backed away without making a sound. Then my boot snapped. A dry branch. The crack echoed through the trees in silence. Then a low whistle, not from the trail, from somewhere behind the shelter. I didn't wait to see who made it. I ran. Branches slapped my face as I stumbled back toward the main trail. I reached my campsite, grabbed my backpack, and started hiking without even stopping to filter water. For the next mile, I kept hearing movement behind me, not constant, just enough to make me turn around every few minutes. Every time, nothing, just trees. Eventually, I reached a trail shelter where 4 other hikers were eating lunch. I told them what I'd found. Older man exchanged a worried look with another hiker. He quietly said, "You're not the first person to mention someone living off this section." Park ranger met us later that afternoon. I led him back toward the campsite. The Fire ring was cold. My tent site was empty. The hidden footpath was still there. But when we reached the clearing, the shelter was gone. Tarps, the chair, the stove, everything, only flattened grass remained. The ranger photographed the area but admitted there wasn't much they could investigate. Whoever had been there had packed up fast. Finished my hike the next day. Instead of staying the rest of the week, I still hike alone, sometimes. But I never camp at a site that already feels lived. And I still have that dented metal camping mug. There's a thin black mark burned into one side that I don't remember putting there. It wasn't there before that trip. Maybe it came from my own campfire, maybe it didn't. I just know that every time I look at it, I remember something the ranger said before we parted ways. There are people out here who aren't hiking. He never told me how long they'd been there, and I never asked. A 6-day backpacking trip through Southern Virginia. I was 32, recently divorced, and trying to clear my head after what had been the worst year of my life. Hiking had always been my reset button. Out there, my biggest concerns were weather, water, and making it to camp before dark. I carried the same gear I'd used for years, including a frayed climbing rope that doubled as a bear bag line. It wasn't pretty anymore, but it had never failed me. The first 2 days were uneventful. I passed a handful of section hikers, signed the shelter logs, and enjoyed the kind of quiet you can only find deep in the mountains. Late on the third afternoon, I stopped beside a small stream to refill my water bottles. While waiting for the filter to finish, I noticed something strange. Across the water, a narrow path, not an animal, trail. It was too straight. The ground had been walked on recently. Curiosity got the better of me. I crossed the stream and followed it for maybe 40 yards. The trees grew thicker until I reached a small clearing. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Someone had built walls out of fallen logs. A blue tarp had been stretched so low it almost disappeared beneath layers of leaves and branches. Smoke drifted lazily from a short metal pipe sticking through the roof. It wasn't an abandoned shelter. Someone was living there. I immediately backed away. As I turned, I noticed something hanging from a branch, a backpack, not mine. It looked almost new. Underneath it sat 3 pairs of hiking boots, different sizes. I suddenly realized something. There should have been people, talking, cooking, moving around. Instead, the woods were completely silent. Then the tarp shifted. I looked back just in time to see a hand pull it aside from the inside. A man stepped halfway out, had a thick beard, dirty clothes, and watched me without saying a word. Our eyes met. Neither of us moved. Finally, he spoke. "You lost?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, I took the wrong path." He nodded. "Once. Trail's back that way." His voice sounded calm, too. Calm. I thanked him and walked away without turning my back completely. The moment the clearing disappeared behind the trees, I picked up my pace. I didn't stop until I reached the Appalachian Trail again. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept telling myself I'd simply found someone living off-grid. Maybe he wanted to be left alone. Maybe I had invaded his privacy. That explanation worked until I reached the next shelter. Retired couple was already there cooking dinner. When I casually mentioned the hidden camp, the husband immediately frowned. "What stream?" I pointed it out on my map. His expression changed. There shouldn't be any camps out there. An hour later, another hiker arrived. Before I could even ask, he interrupted. "Did either of you see somebody watching the trail today?" The shelter suddenly felt much smaller. None of us slept well. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling outside. Not hiking boots on the trail. Slow footsteps in the leaves. Someone was walking around the shelter. No flashlight, no headlamp. Just careful, deliberate steps. One of the other hikers whispered, "Don't move." The footsteps stopped. Then came 3 quiet knocks against one of the shelter posts. Knock, knock, knock. No one answered. Several minutes later, the footsteps faded into the darkness. At sunrise, we found fresh boot prints surrounding the shelter. Only one said whoever it was had walked around us several times. Nothing had been stolen, but hanging from the edge of the shelter roof was my frayed climbing rope. I'd packed it inside my backpack before going to sleep. Someone had removed it, then carefully tied it to the shelter while we slept. None of us understood why. We hiked together instead of splitting up. About 4 miles later, we flagged down a park ranger. He listened carefully but became especially interested when I described the hidden camp. He asked me to mark the location on my map. 2 days later, after I'd finished the hike, the ranger called me. They had found the clearing. The shelter was gone. The fire pit was still warm. Several food cans remained. So did a folding chair. But no one was there. The ranger admitted they'd discovered multiple unofficial camps hidden near that section of trail over the years. Most belonged to people trying to avoid society. Some belonged to fugitives, others, they
never identified. I still hike, but I don't
investigate side paths anymore. The Appalachian Trail already has enough unknowns without creating new ones. Kept my frayed climbing rope. Though, when I unpacked my gear after that trip, I noticed someone had tied a knot near one end. It wasn't a knot I'd ever learned. None of my hiking partners recognized it either. I eventually untied it. But every now and then, I think about how carefully it had been tied. Not to hold anything, just to let me know. Someone had gone through my backpack while I was asleep. During a solo section hike through eastern Tennessee in early October, I was 29 and had taken a week off after finishing a stressful project at work. My plan was simple: hike about 12 miles a day, stay at shelters whenever possible, and enjoy a few days without checking emails every 5 minutes. Folded inside the top pocket of my backpack was a yellow trail map I'd highlighted before leaving home. Every planned campsite, water source, and shelter was marked in bright yellow. On the first afternoon, I noticed the man. He was sitting alone beside the trail, eating from a small metal pot. As I approached, he looked up. We made eye contact, smiled. Afternoon? He didn't answer. He simply watched me walk past. I figured he either hadn't heard me or didn't feel like talking. Not everyone hikes to socialize. About 2 hours later, I reached the shelter where I planned to spend the night. A few other hikers were already setting up. The silent man never arrived. I assumed he'd stopped somewhere else. The next morning, I packed up early and hit the trail just after sunrise. Around mid-morning, I rounded a bend and froze. The same man was sitting on a fallen log ahead of me. There was no trail junction between the shelter and where I found him. No shortcut I knew. Somehow he was in front of me again as I walked past. He looked directly at my backpack, then at me. Still no words. Still no smile. Just that steady stare. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was nearby. Every so often, I'd hear footsteps behind me when I turned around. Nothing. That evening, I reached another shelter again. Several hikers were already there. Again, the silent man never appeared. One of the hikers mentioned seeing someone walking through the trees instead of using the trail. Didn't say anything. I wasn't even sure it was the same person. The third morning began with heavy fog. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards. The woods felt strangely quiet. Even the birds seemed absent. Around noon, I stopped beside a trail sign to check my yellow trail map. That's when I noticed fresh boot prints leading off the trail. They weren't random. They matched my direction of travel, disappearing into the woods before returning to the trail. Farther ahead, I followed them with my eyes until they vanished into the fog. Then I heard a branch snap behind me. turned. The silent man was standing on the trail, closer than he'd ever been before, maybe 40 feet away. He wasn't carrying trekking poles anymore. His backpack was gone. He simply stood there watching. I stepped backward took one slow step forward. I didn't wait for another. Instead of continuing toward the next shelter, I turned onto an old Forest Service road marked on my map. It was longer but much more open. If someone followed me there, I'd see them. For nearly 20 minutes, I walked without looking back. Then, I heard footsteps on gravel, steady, unhurried. Turned, the man had taken the same road still, silent. Still keeping the same distance, my heart started pounding. I pulled out my phone, no signal. Kept walking until I spotted a maintenance truck parked near a locked equipment gate. A forestry worker was loading tools into the back. I waved both arms. The worker looked up. The moment he did, the silent man stopped walking. For the first time in 3 days, he broke eye contact. He turned around and disappeared into the trees without making a sound. The forestry worker asked if I was okay. Explained everything. He drove me to the nearest ranger station. Rangers searched the area that afternoon but found no one matching my description. One ranger asked an odd question. Did he ever ask for food? Money? Directions? No. Did he ever speak? Not once. The ranger nodded slowly, apparently. Other hikers had reported seeing a man fitting the same description over the past several months. Always alone, always silent, never committing a crime anyone could prove. After that trip, I changed the way I hike. I avoid isolated sections unless I'm with someone else. I also stopped posting my hiking plans online before leaving. When I unpacked my gear at home, I unfolded my yellow trail map one last time. Across the margin, in pencil, was a small circle around the shelter where I'd planned to spend my third night. Inside the circle were 2 words. Good choice. I never wrote them. No fingerprints were recovered from the map. To this day, I still don't know when someone could have handled it. But I know one thing. For 3 days, I thought I was watching a stranger. Now I'm not so sure he wasn't the one studying me the entire time.